All right, well, it's very good to be here in Germany. And it's my first time here at DLD. What I wanted to do is first take you through a little bit about who we are and a little bit about how we look at 2015 and how we look at 2015 in Europe. So first, Uber started very much as an unambitious, simple idea. Actually, my co-founder and I were in Paris, and we wanted to get a taxi ride. And I think a lot of folks know it can be pretty difficult to get a taxi ride in Paris. And so we were at a cafe late at night, and we just said, we just wanted to push a button and get a ride. It was really that simple. And we went back to San Francisco, a place where it's very difficult to get a taxi as well, maybe a sister city in that regard. And we started up essentially a side project, which we called Uber. And it started out, it was for me, my co-founder, and 100 of our friends. It wasn't meant to be like a big business. It was just a way for us to get around the city. And for us, it meant no more driving, no more looking for parking in a city that didn't have a lot. It meant that when we were in a car, we could work or talk to friends and family. We had the credit card on file, and so I didn't have to get the wallet out when I left the car. I just walk out. There's no cash. And you'd get to your destination, walk out of the car, and of course you rate the driver on a 5-star basis, which allows us to make sure that there's a service level that's being delivered and sort of accountability for the driver side of the equation. And so what happened was it started out for 100 of our friends, and we would be at restaurants, and then there'd be new friends. They'd say, "Hey, can I do this too?" And we're like, "Well, this is kind of just a private thing." It just turned out that everybody in our city wanted it, and so we opened it up. And what happened was, I would get a car, I'd get out, and of course somebody else would request somewhere else in the city, and then they would get picked up by that same car. In fact, you'd have one car essentially being shared across dozens of people in a single day. And so more riders ultimately meant more cars. And more cars meant lower pickup times. And of course, when you have low pickup times, then that means that drivers are wasting less time going to pick people up, which means they can do more trips per hour. More trips per hour then means the drivers can make more money. It also means you can get prices down. And so it started this virtuous cycle where we are constantly looking for more efficiencies in the system, and with those efficiencies, finding ways to allow drivers to make a higher income and also bring the prices down of this core service. And so we would do all kinds of things for efficiency. We predict where demand was going to be, and we'd give cues to the drivers, essentially heat maps, for how to go where demand is going to be in the next 15 minutes. Those, again, leading to more trips per hour, and this virtuous cycle just kind of keeps spinning. And with recent innovations, something some of you may have heard of, we have in San Francisco, we also have in Paris and New York. It's a service called Uber Pool, which means you push a button and an Uber comes just like it did before. But when you open the door to get in, there's somebody else in the car already. We have so many users in certain cities, so many riders, that two people are literally taking the same trip at the same time. And in a previous world, that's two cars with two separate people in them taking up twice as much space when you could actually take up half as much. And so we have these really interesting visions for, well, when that gets really efficient, of course, what's happening is you're taking cars off the road. You're certainly taking cars out of parking lots, and you're making a huge difference in the city. We have this thing we call the perpetual ride, where a driver picks up one customer, then picks up another, drops one of them off, then picks up another. And what happens is that driver always has a customer in the car. It's sort of like almost like a private bus type service, but on demand and hyper convenient, picking you up exactly where you are and taking you directly to where you want to go. If you can get 10 people trips on this perpetual ride, this Uber Pool ride, and the driver needs to make €25 an hour, you're now looking at a situation where each person trip costs €2.50. And that's sort of the vision of where Uber wants to go, is to get such huge efficiencies that the price of getting around goes far below the cost of owning a car. So Uber is known for its reliability. Sometimes it's even known for being expensive or high-end. We certainly have high-end options, but of course we have low-end options. And the way we look at what we do is we are the cheapest reliable ride always. And the key there is reliable, because you can always have a cheap ride. You can sell a ride for half as much. But if you can't get one, it doesn't really matter. And so our philosophy is to always have an available ride to somebody who wants it. Our mission, we like to say, is transportation as reliable as running water, everywhere for everyone. So where does that vision or that mission go? It means that our customers anywhere in a city have a ride that's within 5 minutes, but it means any city in the world. Today, almost 270 of them. And it becomes ultimately that cost-effective replacement for owning a car. Now, why does this sort of accidental breakthrough from something was just a side project, why does it matter? It matters because in today's world, well, around the world, there are over 1 billion cars out there. 1 billion cars that are 96% unutilized, right? Meaning maybe you are in your car for an hour a day, the other 23 hours it's sitting there doing nothing. Which means, of course, we have this huge infrastructure for storing this highly unutilized asset. Those billion cars, by the way, is $20 trillion of an asset distributed around the world. 350 million in Europe and 50 million here in Germany. We use 15% of our city's space to store these vehicles. We have buildings specifically designed for the storage of this unutilized asset. And of course, like I described earlier, without an Uber pool type mechanism, these assets are poorly organized and poorly allocated. They're not shared, they're inefficiently routed, and of course, 2% of your life is spent sitting in one of these metal boxes, sitting in traffic. And so, of course, that inefficiency also leads to a massive carbon footprint that we all are going to have to live with, of course, our children and grandchildren as well. And then there's things, simple things, but things that matter, like drinking and driving being a major problem in world cities. When everybody owns a car and they feel like they have to drive everywhere because that's how it is, that's how many cities in the world work, then people drink and they drive and accidents happen, and it's not necessary. And so this car replacement story that I alluded to earlier, it's not just a vision or a dream, it's something that's actually taking place today. And it's amazing to see it sort of coming to, being realized. In San Francisco, we launched the whole company 4.5 years ago, June 2010. So 4.5 years old. We have 1.6 million people who've ever ridden an Uber in San Francisco. The equivalent, remember, we have people who are driving on the Uber platform full time. We have people who are driving on the Uber platform for 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week. The equivalent full-time jobs that we've created in San Francisco is 7,500. In New York City, we've been there 3.5 years. We've seen 1.9 million riders. And the equivalent full-time jobs that we've created in 3.5 years is 13,750. In London, we've seen massive growth. It's been 2.5 years. We've seen 1 million riders or close to it, and supporting 7,800 full-time jobs. In Paris, 3 years, 500,000 riders, and 3,700 jobs. You say, well, that's amazing growth. Those are substantial numbers, but what happens when we continue to grow? San Francisco right now is growing 3x year over year, New York City 4x year over year, London 5x, 6x year over year. And so what happens in the coming years, how many jobs, how many unemployed and underemployed people can come onto this platform and find a way to make a living, to be part of an economic opportunity, which is not just, of course, putting food on the table for their family, but making their city better at the same time. And so in Paris, a great example where it's not just about getting people where they want when they want, it also is an incredibly good complement for existing transport options. So in Paris, the metro, of course, is everywhere in Paris. But 15% of all of our rides either pick up or drop off more than a kilometer away from where the metro stops. And so what that means is, by complementing the existing infrastructure that's in place, we're actually extending the ability for public transportation or mass transit to serve people. And so with this success we've seen in many cities, there's just 4 of dozens of examples or even hundreds, we can go to any mayor in any city. Maybe we want to partner with that mayor. Maybe we're not in that city yet. And we can say, look, if we can find a way to partner up, find a regulatory framework that works for making this a reality, we can promise you 10,000 jobs in 4 years. And the vision for what that means in 6 years or 10 years, you're talking about tens of thousands of jobs. You're talking about reduced congestion, of course, reduced pressure on parking, more efficiency on your existing mass transit options. See, we're starting to hit that inflection point at a certain size where the impact that we can bring to cities is huge, and we have proof points that we can talk to these mayors about. And so for us, it's like, well, why aren't we in every city? Why are there certain cities that it just doesn't quite work out? Well, it starts with old transportation rules that are governing essentially an analog economy, right? It's easy to sort of, flippantly say something negative, let's say, about a particular law that is keeping progress from happening. But there are a number of them that serve their purpose. In a world where you get into a taxi and there's no technology, you have a random person getting into a random person's car. And it's important to protect that person's safety. And so what did you have? You had color schemes on taxis so they're identifiable. You knew that it was a legitimate taxi for that city. You had meters in the car so that you knew what you were going to pay when you finished that ride. But what happens when you have new technology? When you have new technology, these rules maybe don't make as much sense. But in addition to those old analog rules that did have a purpose, what we've seen over decades is that there's been almost like a regulatory capture. There's been a situation where we had a good set of rules that protected people, but then a whole new set of rules which protected an industry. For example, in New York City, there were 13,250 taxis in the 1950s. We're now 60 years later, and there are 13,250 taxis in New York. How did that happen? It happened because the existing incumbent industry made sure it did. They wanted to create sort of artificial scarcity. What it means is that the average driver who wants to make a living can't go do so on his own. He has to ask for permission. And when he asks for permission, the taxi company says, sure, that will cost you $140 a day. What that means is that a driver spends $40,000 renting a car every year. He should be driving around in a Bentley. But for that privilege of spending 40 grand a year, he gets to be impoverished. And that is the taxi industry that exists in not just cities in the US, but cities around the world. We have other kinds of rules. There's a rule here in Germany called return to garage. So if you're familiar with a black car service or a chauffeured service, technically, that driver, let's say you call him up and he's supposed to come pick you up, that driver has to go back to his garage and park, and then come back to you to pick you up. That is what the law says. We have 1 or 2 cease and desist that mention this rule. In France, there was a decree that came down. It was what was called the 15-minute rule. So that if you requested a car, whether it be on an app or a phone, and the car came in just a few minutes, there was a 15-minute rule that said you could not enter that vehicle until 15 minutes had passed. Why do these rules exist? They exist because the existing taxi industry is trying to protect itself through, let's call, regulatory capture or legislative capture. One of my most favorite rules, and I'll get moving, is in South Korea. Chauffeured car service in South Korea is totally legal as long as the passenger is not Korean. So if you are Japanese and you are in South Korea and you can take chauffeured limo service all day long, you are obeying the law. But if you are South Korean, it is illegal for you to have a nice ride that you pay a fair price for. So in many cities, the job of driving for a living has become a protected monopoly, right? A protected monopoly means there are more cars on the road, more traffic, higher unemployment, and a bigger carbon footprint. It's not serving the city, it's not serving its citizens, it's serving a few people who own the incumbent industry. And so when new technology comes out, that means new rules are necessary. Mobile tech and GPS tracking mean we don't have to hail a car anymore. There's no longer a situation where an anonymous person is getting into another anonymous person's car. You have a service in the middle, an app like Uber, and there are, of course, competitors that sit in between, branded services that sit in between the rider and the driver that now can be accountable to both. But that doesn't mean that we just enter a world where there's no regulation at all. I think, in fact, though the old rules don't work, the policy principles that drive these rules are the same. One, you want to safeguard rider and driver safety. Two, promote choice and competition so that consumers are served. Three, encourage economic growth and tax revenue. If you accomplish those three things, I think most of us would agree that you have a good regulatory framework. And so what are the regulations that align with these principles? I mean, we have gone to cities around the world, and in fact, spent a lot of 2014 working with cities around the world to make this a reality. Background checks, for instance. In the US, we have national background checks, city, county background checks, motor vehicle record check, basically zero tolerance for any drug or alcohol offense, reckless driving, or any felony at all. Insurance. You want to make sure that in any case that the driver and the rider feel protected no matter what happens. Coverage, it's important to make sure that we have coverage that goes beyond what is required for private cars. This is something, of course, we promise all our users, but something that is important for a regulatory regime to also codify. Choice and competition. Choice, allow platforms to connect a consumer to any transportation provider at different price points, not just a taxi. Give drivers the freedom to choose multiple platforms to make a living. A lot of times, drivers are locked into one platform, and when that happens, let's say it's the taxi industry that exists today, those drivers get screwed over. They don't make what I would call a living wage. They don't make enough money. Economic growth. Abolish limits on the number of transportation jobs. Like I said, in New York, it's not just in New York, it's in most cities around the world. They've literally limited the number of jobs that can be created by the transportation industry so that they can have this asset that's worth a ton of money. Streamline licensing processes so somebody who's underemployed or unemployed can quickly get into that industry and be productive. For professional drivers, but also for those who want to drive maybe just a few hours a day. Maybe this is supplemental income. And on the tax side, bring underground transportation economy, right? When you go and pay a taxi in cash, driver's happy to take cash. It seems like these credit card systems don't work a lot of times. I'm not sure why. But it's because it's an off-the-grid industry. But once Uber goes into a city, it's now on the grid. And so we can partner with tax authorities to increase providers' compliance, those transportation providers, and increase overall tax revenue. So where are we today? So I sort of alluded to where we were in the US. In 2014, and this might come as a surprise for some of you, but in 2014, we worked with 22 different jurisdictions to pass laws regulating ride-sharing in the last year. Now, US is a little bit ahead of some of our other efforts internationally because, well, of course, we started in the US. But our international efforts aren't that far behind, and I think in Europe, we really want to make that the 2015 effort. So today in Europe, we have strong consumer adoption in many cities in the EU. We talked about Paris and London, of course. But in the Netherlands, Sweden, and Belgium, we also have growing businesses. Of course, we have challenges from incumbents. You may have read about them. France, Spain, Germany. Incumbents often are taking legal means to try to slow down progress. Competition authorities, however, across the EU have spoken out, urging governments to repeal anti-competitive laws and regulations. These are competition authorities from France, from Italy, Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, etc. And that's important to know because they see the rules that are out there that are keeping progress from happening, and they know that it's not good for the consumer, and it's not good for the cities themselves. And it's good for, obviously, for us, and I think for the cities, for these authorities to speak out. And so progressive legislation is now being considered. Well, we've got legislation being considered in Netherlands, in Brussels, and Helsinki. Of course, we'd like to see it in a few more places. And so my main message today is this, is that in 2015, we want to make 2015 the year where we establish a new partnership with EU cities, where we push for progressive regulations that ensure innovation and help build the smart cities of tomorrow, some of which I've outlined earlier, where we promote core city functions through partnerships on data and technology, and where we provide massive economic benefit to cities and their economies. What does this mean at the end of 2015? It means if we can make these partnerships happen, we create 50,000 new EU jobs. And remember, that's for 2015. That's in 1 year. And this is an exponentially growing company with operations that exponentially grow in each of the cities. So what happens when that triples the year after and doubles the year after that? It becomes a huge job generator. We want to take 400,000 cars off of EU roads in 2015, and we want to bring Uber Pool to more EU cities, reducing congestion and emissions. So that's our message for 2015. I think I'm probably going to be spending a little bit more time here in Europe. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Danke.